Dr. Baskin, we're honored to have you speak to us today.
Thank you very much. Good evening from Jerusalem. Good morning to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. I think this is my third or fourth time with you, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. I want to start with a bit of an amusing story that connects directly to what I've been doing over the past 2 years, and more specifically over the last months. In December of 2024, we read that President-elect Trump had appointed someone named Steve Witkoff to be his Middle East envoy. Someone like myself, deep in the politics of the Middle East and this entire region. I had never heard of Steve Witkoff. He was not someone who grew up in the world of diplomacy. And shortly after we heard that he was appointed, my Palestinian partner from East Jerusalem, Samer Sinjalawi, read somewhere that Steve Witkoff was going to be appearing as a keynote speaker at the Bitcoin conference in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And Samer called me and said, Gershon, let's go to Abu Dhabi to the Bitcoin conference and try and meet Witkoff. Quite frankly, I never heard of the guy. I didn't know who he was. I looked online to find out who he was. I learned that he was a New York real estate tycoon. I learned that he made $635 million by selling the Park Lane Hotel to the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. I further learned that unlike every other presidential envoy to the Middle East, who often have been American Jews, Witkoff was not a person who was Israel-focused. He didn't have any long-term experience with Israel. He was not invested in Israel. He was someone who had investments in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And I thought this was a very unusual kind of selection for someone to be the Middle East envoy of the new incoming president. Well, we went to Abu Dhabi and we signed up for the Bitcoin conference, and we arrived at the Bitcoin conference, got the schedule of the conference, only to learn that Witkoff was going to be speaking in a part of the conference that was closed. There was a $10,000 per person buy-in to participate in these high wealth end individuals at the Bitcoin conference. So I was thinking, why did we bother traveling to Abu Dhabi and paying to sign up to this conference to meet a guy who we're never going to see? And Samer, my Palestinian partner, said, let's wait, we'll find him. Well, we found on the schedule when he was going to be speaking and where he was going to be speaking, and we waited outside of that area. Before Witkoff's turn to speak, he actually got up from his seat and went to the men's room, and we followed him. And as Witkoff was coming out of the men's room, we cornered him, and we introduced ourselves. We handed him our business cards. We handed him a newspaper article that Samer and I had co-authored, and said that we wanted to be in contact with him, and he said, welcome. Well, from that time, even before he entered the White House as the official US envoy, I started communicating with him. For months, my communication with him was mostly one way. I would send him articles that I wrote. I would send him feedback of what I thought needed to be done. The bottom line of what I was writing to him over months was that the war in Gaza has to end, and that the only person in the world who can end the war is President Trump. That was the bottom line of my message. Most of the time, Witkoff would respond with an emoji or with a word, I agree, or I don't agree with this, but it was mostly a one-way communication. In February of 2025, Netanyahu made his visit to the White House, the first foreign leader to meet with once again, President Donald Trump. My hope prior to that meeting and in my messages to Witkoff was, this is the opportunity to end the war in Gaza. It had already been going on way longer than it should have. At this point, there were still more than 100 Israeli hostages in Gaza, believed that more than half of them were alive at the time, and that if Donald Trump were to tell Netanyahu to end the war, it wasn't like the Biden administration or the Obama administration when there was a Democrat in office in Washington, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu always had the Republicans to go behind the back of the president and the administration and lobby the Republican Congress or other influential Republicans in order to put pressure on the American president. But with Trump in office, there was no one for Netanyahu to go around the back of the president and try and enlist the support of someone else to end the war. And I had great hopes in February of 25 that Netanyahu would come back from his visit in Washington and find some way to explain to the public that Israel won the war and that it was time to end the war and we would bring all the hostages home. But instead, what in fact happened is that rather than Trump telling Netanyahu to end the war, Netanyahu convinced Trump that Israel would win the war through increased military pressure. Israel would rescue the hostages as a result of military pressure, and Trump gave Netanyahu a green light to escalate the war, to conquer all of Gaza City, places that Israel had already conquered several times in the Gaza Strip and was going in and out, and now we were on the road to serious escalation. There's no question in my mind, and I said this repeatedly in the Israeli media, that the military pressure doesn't rescue hostages. The military pressure kills hostages. And along with killing hostages, it kills thousands of Palestinians. My message to Witkoff repeatedly over this period of time was that there could only be a negotiated end to the war, that the only way to return the Israeli hostages was through a negotiated agreement with Hamas, and that there was no other way that this was going to happen. There was pushback from the American side. They were reluctant, but they were working through the mediators. And here it was a very interesting story because Witkoff is someone who had investments in Qatar and in other parts of the Arab world. Witkoff was very, very close friends with the Emir of Qatar and with the Prime Minister of Qatar. They were on a first name basis. They were buddy-buddy, and the Qataris were playing a very important role in the mediation. In fact, when I had suggested to Witkoff that the Egyptians have more experience negotiating with Hamas than the Qataris do and perhaps have more leverage over Hamas, Witkoff told me he prefers to work through the Qataris. He has a better relationship with them. Around June of 2025, Witkoff started engaging me more directly, and our contact became much more two-way and much more intensive. And Witkoff had come to the conclusion that I had been pushing for months that there had to be a negotiated end to the war. The big difference that I had with Witkoff throughout this period was that Witkoff bought into the Israeli line that Hamas could be brought to surrender. And he would give me examples of World War II and the Nazis and the Japanese. He even gave me an example that the war against crime and murder in the South Bronx was achieved through not giving in and not negotiating, but demanding that the gangs that were burning down the South Bronx and killing so many people a year had to be dealt with by brute force. And I argued with Witkoff that Hamas, as a kind of fundamentalist Islamic organization that it is, will never surrender. They were willing to fight to the very last Gazan. They would not lay down their weapons. They would certainly not surrender to Israel. And when you have a movement with a fanatic theology where sanctification of death is a commandment, the highest achievement, according to Hamas, that one can make in their life is to die as a martyr, you don't have deterrence and you can't defeat them militarily. You can only find a way of finding a negotiated agreement, and this is what I said. Well, around June, Witkoff began to think that the best road might be a negotiated agreement. And from that point on, I was communicating directly with Hamas leaders that I've been doing for 18 years and with Witkoff. From my assessment, there was no reason whatsoever to try to negotiate with the Israeli government. In September of 2024, I brought an agreement from Hamas in writing, in English and in Arabic, and a voice note saying that Hamas in September of 2024 was ready to end the war and they would release all the hostages within a period of 3 days, and that the war would come to an end within a period of 3 weeks and Israel would withdraw from Gaza. I reported this to the negotiators in Israel, who said that this is a great agreement, but the prime minister and the government of Israel don't want to end the war. That was the bottom line. The government of Israel didn't want to end the war. I communicated with the Egyptians. I was invited by Qatar to Doha to meet with the Qatari negotiators. I communicated with the president of the United States and the person who was working for Biden at the time as his point man on this issue, Brett McGurk. The proposal that I brought from Hamas arrived on the desk of the head of the CIA, and it was on Biden's desk. And I met with two people from Biden's negotiating team at a hotel in Tel Aviv, and they were very, very frustrated, but they said they couldn't get any traction on this agreement, that Biden was advancing his own agreement that he presented in May of 24, which was for a partial ceasefire and a partial release to the hostages. I had commented immediately after Biden had presented that in public that this was a bad deal. And I didn't understand why the United States was pushing to negotiate an agreement with Hamas that would end the war for a temporary period and only release part of the hostages. I called it a bad deal. And that's when I was approached by families of hostages who asked me to see if I could get a better deal. And I did. I got an agreement from Hamas that ending the war would bring about a release of all the hostages. It would also bring about a withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. But this was not going anywhere. I couldn't get any traction from it. And by June of 2025, when Witkoff began to understand, with the support of Trump, that a negotiated agreement was the way to move forward, this is what we started working on. It took a long period of time, but by the beginning of September, we had a document, a working document. We called it the 8-point document. And it was an agreement to end the war. It was an agreement by Hamas to release all the hostages. It was an agreement by Hamas that they would no longer govern Gaza or be in charge of any governing functions in Gaza, including security. On September 5th, the Hamas leadership met with the Qatari negotiators in order to receive the 8-point document. After Witkoff and a senior Hamas leader and myself had worked out this 8 points agreements, I conveyed to Witkoff that Hamas wanted to receive the agreement officially, not through me. I'm an unofficial channel. I don't work for anyone. I'm not an Israeli government employee. And they wanted to know that the Americans stood behind it. So they wanted to receive it from the Qataris. And on September 5th, Hamas went to the Qataris, and the Qatari negotiators gave Hamas a different document, not the 8-point document. They gave them a 5-point document, and the 5-point document was a copy and paste of Netanyahu's conditions to end the war in Gaza. And I got a phone call from one of the Hamas leaders who said, we don't understand what's going on here. They gave us this 5-point document of Netanyahu's that we cannot agree to. I asked him, did you ask the Qataris about our document, the 8-point document? They said yes. The Qataris gave them this 8-point document, and they said, these are American ideas, but we want you to agree to the 5-point document. I contacted Witkoff immediately. I opened up CNN, and I saw Witkoff sitting next to Trump at the US Open tennis tournament, and Witkoff is communicating with me by WhatsApp. And I say to Witkoff, what's going on? Hamas received this 5-point document, not our 8-point document. And Witkoff says to me, tell Hamas to agree to the 8 points, and we'll bring Israel along. Well, I communicated that to Hamas, but they were confused because the Qataris insisted that they have to agree to the 5-point document. I told this to Witkoff, and on September 8th in the evening at about 10 o'clock, 10:20 Israel time in the evening, Witkoff called me by phone and said the Hamas delegation is sitting with the Qataris now, getting a new document. It's the last and final version of the American proposal. It includes our 8 points, and tell Hamas that they have to say yes to it. Well, the next day, September 9th, Israel tried to kill the Hamas leadership by attacking the residence of Khalil al-Khaya, the head of Hamas, in Doha, violating Qatari sovereignty. Immediately after the assassination attempt by Israel of the Hamas leadership, the Israeli media was reporting that all the Hamas leadership was killed. There was a euphoria in Israel. We killed all the leadership, and now we're going to free the hostages. When I knew if they had succeeded in killing the Hamas leadership, the hostages in Gaza would have all been executed. There's no way that the Hamas leadership in Gaza and the military command in Gaza would have released the hostages after Israel killed the Hamas leadership. But after half a day went by. It was very clear that the information on the success of the attack of Israel against Hamas was questionable. I tried to call the Hamas leadership, people that I had their phone numbers for. There were 8 people from the Hamas leadership, all of them outside of Gaza. I couldn't reach any of them. Their phones were closed, and no one really knew what happened to them. On the next day, on the 10th, I got a WhatsApp message from one of the Hamas leaders who said, "We're all alive. None of us were killed. The Qataris told us to close our phones and to not go out, so you're not going to hear from us." About 5 days later, I got a WhatsApp communication from the main Hamas leader that I've been in contact with for years, who was very angry. He said, "You told us to trust the Americans. You told us that the Americans are the only ones who could end the war. And look, Israel couldn't do what they did without a green light from Washington. They couldn't have sent rockets to kill the Hamas leadership without Trump agreeing to this." Immediately after the attack, I asked Witkoff, I didn't ask him, I said to Witkoff, I wrote to him, I said, you know that there isn't a person in the Middle East and probably around the world who believes that Israel did this without a green light from Trump. It simply couldn't have happened without a green light from Trump. Witkoff had called me back and said, "Tell them it's not true. We didn't approve it. We didn't want it. We're against it. We'll condemn it." He told me to tell the Hamas to read Trump's Truth Social. It'll be all out there on Truth Social. And this, anyone who knows Trump knows that when Trump writes something on Truth Social, it's Trump's way of turning something imaginable into reality. Reality is reflected in Truth Social. And in fact, Trump put out on Truth Social that the United States did not greenlight the assassination attempt. They condemned it. They didn't support it. They have nothing to do with it. About 10 days after the attack, Witkoff contacted me and said, "We have a plan." He didn't tell me what the plan was, but the next day, President Trump on air introduced what was then 21 points agreement. He notified the world that he had agreement of all the Arab countries for the 21-point agreement. He notified the world that he was going to be meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Netanyahu, during Heads of State Week at the General Assembly meeting in New York in September, Netanyahu was one of the last speakers to the General Assembly during Heads of State Week. He, of course, addressed an empty General Assembly. Everyone walked out on him. And when he finished his speech on Friday, he was ordered to show up at the White House. And in the Oval Office, on camera, in front of the whole world, Trump humiliated Netanyahu, handing him the phone and demanding that he call the Qatari prime minister and apologize for the attack against the Hamas leadership in Doha, violating Qatari sovereign territory. The emissary of the prime minister of Qatar was sitting in the Oval Office across from Netanyahu at the time. Trump completely scripted the phone call, told Netanyahu what to say, and Netanyahu did it on camera in front of the world. And when all the journalists and the cameras left the Oval Office, Trump turned to Netanyahu and said, "Bibi, the war in Gaza is over. You're going to leave this White House and you're going to announce to the world that there's an agreement on the table that you accept. You're going to get all your hostages. We're going to bring all the hostages home." There were 48 of them at that time, 20 alive and 28 deceased hostages. You're going to get all the hostages, but you're going to announce that you agree to this agreement. You can declare victory, you can say whatever you want, but you're going to agree to this. And this is, in fact, what happened. The next problem was how to get Hamas to say yes. Witkoff told me, you got to tell the Hamas people they have to say yes. There's no way. At this point, the Americans also brought in the Turks. Donald Trump is very close to President Erdogan. Witkoff was very close to the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan, and also very close to the head of Turkish intelligence, Ibrahim Kalin. And they brought in the Turks. And the Turks, the Qataris, and the Egyptians weighed heavily on Hamas. And Hamas responded to Trump's 21 points. Hamas's answer was very typical of Hamas. Their answer was yes, but. And Trump took the Hamas answer of yes, but, and put out on Truth Social that Hamas has said yes. He didn't put yes, but. And once again, Trump turned this imaginary reality in reality by putting it on Trump Social. I had communicated with that point with Witkoff that the Qataris are very good at the big picture, but now you got to get into the details. And those are the Egyptians. The Egyptians deal much better with the details. And whether because I said that or because that was the natural thing that needed to happen, talks opened up between Israel and Hamas through the Americans, the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Turks in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Two things happened that were remarkable and unprecedented at the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting. One is that late in the evening, at midnight, on the last day of the negotiating meeting, Jared Kushner and Witkoff knocked on the door of Khalil al-Chaya, the head of Hamas, and had a face-to-face meeting between the United States' most senior representatives and the head of Hamas. In 18 years of Hamas governance, this had never happened, a direct meeting between the United States at that level and the head of Hamas. Something else happened. You talk about your own society. Something very human took place at the meeting between Witkoff and Khalil Chaya. Khalil Chaya's son was killed in the Israeli attack. Steve Witkoff's lost a son to a drug overdose. And Witkoff turned to Khalil Chaya and said, as a father who buried his son, I'm speaking to you as a father who buried your son. And this very human interaction, how do we say it, softened the heart of Khalil Chaya. And at the end of this face-to-face meeting between Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and Khalil Chaya said that Hamas agrees to the agreement. And at 2 o'clock in the morning in Sharm el-Sheikh, they signed the agreement. And here the second unprecedented thing happened. In the room where they signed the agreement was the Qatari delegation, the Egyptian delegation, the Turkish delegation, the Israeli delegation, and sitting across the room at the table were 4 senior representatives of Hamas, the first time that Israelis and Hamas sat in the same room and signed an agreement to put an end to the war in Gaza. The Americans then took the agreement to the Security Council and passed a Security Council resolution. It took a couple of weeks to get that done. And the war officially came to an end. Now we know this happened 3 months ago. And while the main war has actually ended, phase 2 of the agreement, which is beyond the ceasefire and beyond the return of humanitarian aid to Gaza, also involves the creation of the Board of Peace, which will be headed by Donald Trump and other heads of state. Under the Board of Peace is an executive committee, which will serve as the executive committee directing, assisting, coordinating with the Palestinian technocratic government that will be established on the ground, along with the Palestinian Security Force. And alongside of all of this will be an international stabilization force, bringing in foreign troops to the Gaza Strip. During the past 3 months, Israel has breached the agreement almost every day. More than 400 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since the end of the war. Israel is still sitting on 53% of the Gaza Strip, where only 5 to 10% of the Gazan population live. Some 2 million Palestinians have been squeezed into 47% of the Gaza Strip. More than 80% of them are living in tents and bombed out buildings. During the war in Gaza, Israel destroyed Gaza. And let's be very clear, Israel committed war crimes in Gaza, Israel committed crimes against humanity, and Israel, according to international law, committed acts of genocide in Gaza. The civilization of Gaza has been destroyed. More than 90% of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. That's private housing, commercial real estate, public schools, universities, public buildings, roads, water, electricity, sewage infrastructure. Gaza has been destroyed. It has been made uninhabitable for the more than 2 million people who live there. 90% of them are squeezed into 47% of the Gaza Strip. And for those of you who might not know, this has been a very harsh winter these past month and a half. with torrential rains in Gaza, and not only people living in tents without sufficient shelter and heat and clothing and their belongings, but much of the tents have been blown away and have been flooded over the last month and a half as well. It is a human catastrophe. The humanitarian organizations which can provide humanitarian aid to Gaza have not been allowed by Israel to work in Gaza. The Americans apparently are developing a system of private sector development aid, and this is what we are seeing happening as some 35 international organizations have not been allowed to be registered by Israel, and some other organizations that were working have been unregistered by Israel. I've had an argument with the Americans about this, saying that there's no reason why Israel should have a say on who or what gets into Gaza or who or what gets out of Gaza. This needs to be taken away from the Israelis because the Israelis have a process of vetting. All the international organizations are required to turn over the names of their personnel in Gaza, who are mostly Gazans, to be vetted by the Israelis. And the Israelis don't get the list from the international organizations because they have very bad experience with Israel. Many of their personnel have been arrested or killed by Israel over the past 2 years and 3 months. So they refused to cooperate, but they did agree to a third-party vetting mechanism. But the Americans won't support that because the Israelis are against it. And what I see happening is a private sector mechanism that's going to be brought into take. We're about to begin phase 2, which is very good. It's been postponed because a lot of the decisions that needed to be made have been weighed in with different countries, mostly in the region, Arab countries, leveraging their power with the Americans to persuade the Americans to make decisions that aren't necessarily hand in hand with the American vision or with the Israeli vision. But what we expect to happen is on the 23rd of January, apparently President Trump will be convening the Board of Peace for the first time after the Davos World Economic Forum Summit in Davos, Switzerland. It's expected that the Board of Peace will include heads of state such as Trump, Stammer, maybe Macron, Meloni from Italy, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Sisi of Egypt, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, probably Recep Tayyip Erdogan from Turkey, probably the president of the World Bank and the president of the International Monetary Fund will be there as well. They have hired already a former Bulgarian politician and UN diplomat named Nikolai Mladenov, who was the Middle East envoy for Ban Ki-moon when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, to be the coordinator of the executive board. The executive board will be made up of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and Tony Blair, and as they described it, and their friends. So it'll be an executive board with Nikolai Mladenov, this Bulgarian politician, being the coordinator of the executive committee to the Palestinian technocratic government. Apparently today or tomorrow or the following day, the Egyptians have convened a meeting of all the Palestinian political factions to present to them the names of the people who have been vetted by the United States to form the Palestinian Technocratic Committee in Gaza. There was a list of about 45 names, and to the best of my knowledge, they have selected 15 of them, all of them prominent, important people from Gaza who have worked in the private sector and are not connected in any way to Hamas or to the Islamic Jihad. They've been vetted probably by the Israelis as well as the Americans, and we should know in the coming days who these people are going to be. When the international process is finished, the Board of Peace, the Executive Committee, the Palestinian Technocratic Government, the beginning of an establishment of a Palestinian security force, there will be also the deployment of the International Stabilization Force. We don't know which countries are going to be sending troops. We do know the Egyptians will be there. We can presume, despite announcements that Azerbaijan will be sending troops, maybe Indonesia, maybe some troops from the United Arab Emirates, we're not sure. There might be some kind of European presence of some type in the Gaza Strip. The importance of the International Stabilization Force and this is once again unprecedented, is that we are seeing the internationalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinians have been demanding international protection for decades. This is the first time that there's actually going to be an international military presence in the Gaza Strip, which will essentially take away from Israel the ability to engage in military action in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians are essentially going to have a framework for international protection. If this can somehow be implemented in the future in the West Bank, we will have a change in the entire dynamic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has never existed before. Here I'll just conclude and open this up for discussion. There's a lot of unknowns still. It's a very fragile ceasefire. Hamas as an organization is finished in Gaza. President Abbas, the 90-year-old Palestinian president in the 22nd year of a 4-year term in the West Bank, is also finished. Abbas has promised Macron and Mohammed bin Salman and the United Nations General Assembly that Palestinian national elections will be conducted within a year from ending the war. In the year 2026, both the State of Israel and the Palestinians will be going to elections. The Palestinian new election law that Abbas obligated to impose will prevent any political party that supports the armed struggle against Israel will not be allowed to participate in elections. If that happens, that's a giant stride forward in protecting the Palestinian electoral process from organizations like Hamas that seek to destroy the possibility of Palestine being ever made into a state and having freedom. The bottom line on this entire conflict, and people want to make this a very complex conflict, and it has a lot of complexities to it. But the bottom line here, and this has to be one of the main lessons learned from this war, and this war in Gaza has to be the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We cannot continue to do this, is that there is an equation, and the equation is the following. Israel will never have security if the Palestinians don't have freedom. The Palestinians will never have freedom if Israel doesn't have security. This is the bottom line of this conflict. Israel needs security. The Palestinians need freedom. In order for Israel to achieve its security, it is not going to be by more weapons and by more military actions, whether it be in Palestine or around the region. The Palestinians will never have freedom if they don't recognize that they themselves are the ones who have to fight against terrorism and groups like Hamas, because they will never achieve their freedom if Israel doesn't have security. That's the bottom line here. And I'm confident, I should say I'm hopeful, that this will be the lesson learned by Israelis and Palestinians. Right now, we're still licking the wounds. We're still in the trauma. We're beginning to enter a post-traumatic period. But Israeli and Palestinian societies have been traumatized by this war. And we have to come to the conclusion that this has to end. So thank you once again, and I'm more than happy to open this up for discussion and taking your questions.
Oh, okay, thank you very much, Dr. Baskin. We're going to have a slightly extended Q&A as Dr. Baskin cannot stay after the end of our program. And I would ask that you give a concise question that ends with a question mark so that everybody can have a chance. And this opportunity is a very special one for our society. So raise your hand and we will come around with the mic. We have a question on Zoom. They have a question on Zoom? Okay. Who is Frank? Frank, unmute and start your question.
Thank you so much, Gershon, for this amazing presentation. So eye-opening about the backstory about what really really going on. Yes, I'll get to that in just a moment. But I just have to thank you for your incredible service, persevering for peace in this at this time.
Thank you.
You ended with the equation statement about security for Israelis and freedom for Palestinians. My question to you is, how prepared are both Israelis and Palestinians to recognize and honor this equation in the hopes of peace?
The answer is very simple. They are not. Israeli and Palestinian societies are very apart from each other. They have more stereotypes about the other side and a deep conviction that, and I've heard this for the last 25 years from Israeli and Palestinians of all ages, all around. I want peace, but they don't. This is a conviction that you will hear from Israelis and Palestinians who each side deeply believe that they want peace, but the obstacle is that we don't have partners for peace on the other side. And this is why these elections that are coming up both in Israel and Palestine are so tremendously important. Because if we manage, we're not going to have any ideal government coming in Israel, and it's unlikely that there will be a radical change on the Palestinian side. But if there are voices that are elected in Israel and in Palestine that say, we generally want peace, and if there were partners for peace on the other side, we're ready to make the concessions necessary. This is the primary work that my Palestinian partner and I engage in. In order to achieve this, we brought former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert into an agreement with the former Palestinian foreign minister, who happens to be a nephew of the late Yasser Arafat. And these two men went around the world presenting their joint vision. They signed a joint paper together. We published an op-ed piece that they wrote in 30 newspapers, leading newspapers around the world in 15 different languages. We've gotten them on the Israeli and Palestinian. And this is the kind of partnership that we want to model and shape, and the partnership between myself and my partner, Samer Sinjalawi. Samer now has formed a new political party, which is called the Palestinian Party of Moderation. And they're going to be participating in local governmental elections in the West Bank in April. And if we can elevate these voices that exist within both societies that say, I want peace, and if I believe there were partners on the other side, we could do it. This is our challenge right now, because right now the two publics are very far apart.
Steve has a question. We have a lot of hands up. Again, concise and direct question.
I'll be brief. Dr. Baskin, you said that Israel will never have security until the Palestinians have freedom. What constitutes Palestinian freedom?
A Palestinian independent sovereign state next to Israel, based on the borders of 1967 with East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. That's what freedom means. That they are the masters of their own destiny, that they have a flag and a state. By the way, the state of Palestine is recognized by, I think, 157 member states of the United Nations. They could get the recognition of 192 member states of the United Nations, and their state won't exist until Israel recognizes it. So what they need to get is an Israeli agreement to Palestinian statehood, self-determination, sovereignty, etc. That can only be done through a negotiated agreement with Israel.
How do you have an independent, sovereign Palestinian state if there's no Palestinian leadership or government?
Well, they're going to hold elections during this year, and they haven't held elections since 2006. President Abbas prevented elections from being held in May of 2021 because he was going to lose those elections. Hamas would not have won, but the alternative independents would have won those elections. They would have formed a coalition government, but Abbas knew he was going to lose, so he canceled those elections. But Palestinians will hold elections during 2026. And if they do elect a reasonable government that will be supported by the international community, Israel will face a new reality where they won't have a divided leadership, which Netanyahu's strategy since 2009 was to keep the Palestinian leadership separate between Fatah and Hamas, the West Bank and Gaza, keeping a Palestinian authority that was willing to negotiate, delegitimizing that government while empowering Hamas and having Hamas funded by Qatar throughout these years. And of course, that blew up in our face on October 7th.
We have a question online. Who is it, please? Wayne, please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, my question is, why haven't the non-Israeli parties to this situation done more to address the humanitarian problems in the last several months and currently?
That's a very good question. You could broaden the question and ask, why has Israel had impunity for 57 years of occupation of the Palestinian Authority territories. Why does Israel have impunity when the International Court of Justice determines that the occupation is not temporary, it is permanent, and it is illegal? Why has Israel been able to build settlements for all these years, which have been determined by international law as being a breach of international law? Israel has been given impunity by the international community. No one in the international community had the power to force anything on Israel until President Trump. And I imagine that most of you, like myself, have great trepidation about Donald Trump and who he is and what he stands for and what he believes and the lack of a moral compass and everything that goes along with Donald Trump. I was on American media before the elections last November saying that, in my view, Donald Trump is the most dangerous person in the world. And he very, very well might be the most dangerous person in the world. But as an Israeli working for Israeli-Palestinian peace, he saved us. Donald Trump brings to the world a new form of international relations that we have never seen before. And the entire world, with the exception of Putin and Xi, bow down to him. The big difference between Trump and Biden, from a point of view of foreign policy, is that, with all due respect to Biden projected American weakness around the world, and Donald Trump presents American power to the world. And that's a very big difference in the world that we live in today. And we see that emerging by everything that Trump does, even against his own MAGA people. What he did in Venezuela. What he did in Venezuela shakes Iran, and the demonstrations and the protest movement against the Ayatollahs in Iran, against the religious leadership and the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, is also happening because of what Trump did in Venezuela. These are unthinkable things that never happened before. And it's not just vis-a-vis Israel, but especially vis-a-vis Israel. There was no one in the world who could put Israel in its place. The European Union were really good at making great speeches and issuing declarations, but they never used their power, their soft power or their hard power, against Israel. And Israel is afraid of Trump because he's unpredictable, because Israel understands that demography is changing in the United States, because even within the Republican Party, there's a wing of the MAGAs who are against Israel today, and they're very powerful people in the party, even amongst evangelical Christians who worship Israel and believe that all the Jews need to come to Israel in order for Jesus to return. The second generation of evangelicals are not so loving as Israel as their parents are. So there's a changing reality. And this is why Donald Trump had the ability to tell Netanyahu that the war in Gaza is over and the war in Gaza ended.
So why hasn't he addressed the humanitarian problems?
Well, they have, but they have been working over the last 3 months, mainly in putting together the Board of Peace, the Executive Committee, and the Palestinian Technocratic Committee. They knew very well that Israel was continuing to breach the agreement and to prevent the humanitarian organizations from working. But according to the American representative of the government of the United States here on the ground, his data shows that the number of trucks, which is 600 trucks a day that are supposed to enter in Gaza, is in fact the number. In fact, they say that more than 600 trucks a day have been going in, but not through the humanitarian organizations. They've been going in through private sector. So there's a whole change in the way that aid is being distributed. But apparently there isn't a food shortage in Gaza. There's a lot of aid that's waiting to get into Gaza that Israel doesn't let into Gaza because these organizations are not registered, and the United States has not pressured Israel to vet them and to allow them in because they have a different model, which we're going to see unfolding.
Thank you.
I think these two hands were up first.
Thank you, Dr. Baskin. Which Palestinians get to vote? Does that include imprisoned Palestinians? And how does that Marwan Barghouti influence the second phase of the ceasefire?
Well, when they will have national elections, all the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem will be allowed to vote. Palestinians who are prisoners in Israel will not be allowed to vote. That's for sure. Marwan Barghouti is a big question. The Americans actually wanted Marwan Barghouti to be on the list of prisoners to be released in the exchange deal for the Israeli hostages. And they pushed for that, but they were not willing to go to war with Israel over the release of Marwan Barghouti. The campaign for Marwan's release continues. I don't know if he will ever be released. What I can tell you is that Marwan, over the last 2 years and 3 months since the beginning of the war on October 7th, has been tortured in prison. He has been starved. He has been moved from prison to prison. He sits in solitary confinement in the dark most of the hours of the day. And he's not alone. Most of the other security prisoners with his kind of profile are getting the same treatment because our prison authority is now run by Ben Gvir, our Kahanist, extremist, fanatic minister of national security, who's in charge of the prison authority. And they have adopted his methodologies in the prison. So we saw the pictures of all the Israeli hostages coming home, emaciated, looking very bad, pale, and losing a lot of their body mass. What we haven't seen on television, you probably haven't seen in the United States at all, is the Palestinian prisoners who were released, about 2,000 of them, also coming out of the Israeli prisons, emaciated, wounded, tortured, having gone through a hell in the Israeli prisons over the last 2 years as well.
Can you turn me on? I'm afraid we've run out of time. Dr. Baskin, thank you so much for taking your time and explaining things so concisely and in depth. Best wishes to you in your continuing efforts.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good day.